This institution is covering for crimes against a people that are besieged, that have been encaged in a strip of land that even the very corrupt Israeli supporter and war criminal David Cameron has said is the world's largest open-air prison. If that far-right gentleman is calling what Israel is doing imprisonment of a population of which the majority are children, surely the BBC at some point might have some reflection as to what it is a party to. And it is a party to a country that is a rogue state, which is Israel, that has violated more United Nations resolutions than any other country that exists, and that has maintained a medieval, hermetic siege on a population of 1.7 million on the most crowded place on the planet, the majority of whom are children. The majority of whom are children. We will look back with shame when we know that a population, the most of whom are children, has been kept in a prison. If you are born Palestinian, you know that you will be imprisoned from the minute you're born. And when the BBC is completely kowtowing to any Israeli official that says they're all terrorists, all those 800,000 Palestinians that have already lived through 3 wars if they are 7 years old. And it's not a war. These are continuous mass murderous attacks on a civilian population. I was in Gaza for 2 years. I saw the attacks in 2012. I was in the hospitals when day after day after day there were children brought into those hospitals screaming, mothers outside. We saw a child in the intensive care unit. Her name was Adie. She was 1.5 years old. She was grey. There was no life in her face whatsoever. We went out. We were told by the doctor she was not going to make it. We still saw the family outside praying on their knees, crying, hoping for just a bit more life for their dear child Adie. She died. She was one of the 30 that died in the attacks in 2012. These are crimes, and I saw them close up. And then I looked at the BBC website and saw how it was reporting these crimes when it was, at that point, 50 Palestinians killed, 15 children killed, no Israelis. That was the allotted comparison at the time, and the BBC website had their 6 headlines. Hamas rockets fired out of Gaza. Israeli officials say we will increase the targeted assassinations. Gaza will respond with terror, says American chief. These were the headlines on the BBC as yet more mass murder was taking place against the Palestinians. Every single interview that takes place on the BBC to an Israeli official, they get a free rein to say whatever they like, and most of it is utter racist nonsense. Any of the Israeli ideas and thoughts about what they can justify for mass murder of 500 children in 50 days like took place a year ago, anybody that can justify that or attempt to and not have an interviewer, not one interview on the BBC who challenges them. Anybody can give some comeback, BBC, about the false representations you are giving of the occupation, ethnic cleansing and mass murder of Palestinians that has taken place since Israel was created on the ruins of Palestinian refugees. Go to the BBC website. BBC website, have a look at the history. What about the beginning when Israel was created by ethnic cleansing most of the population of Palestine? 531 villages. Do we see that on the BBC website, this initial mass crime that wiped Palestine off the map? No, we do not see any of this. This is the initial crime that began the whole massive problem. In Gaza, if I speak to a Palestinian, any Palestinian, you ask them where they're from, certainly 2/3 are refugees. You ask them where they're from, they will tell you a village or town that does not exist anymore, that has been turned to rubble by Israeli bulldozers. These are the mass crimes that began against Palestine in 1948. They've continued ever since, and BBC has continued to hide these crimes and to justify these crimes. These are crimes against humanity. These are crimes that murder 500 children in 50 days, 10,000 injured. They're talking about over 400,000 children in Gaza who are still suffering the mental illness and psychological shock from the attacks a year ago. And if it wasn't the attacks a year ago, it was the attacks 3 years ago. And if it wasn't the attacks 3 years ago, it was the attacks in Kasled 2009. In 2009, there was 1,400 murdered. The only way we managed to get something out of the BBC was when they couldn't get a reporter in, so they had to use their Palestinian producer reluctantly. And he actually interviewed Mads Gilbert, who actually had a few minutes to tell us that most of the people being brought into the hospitals in Gaza were civilians, and he was a doctor in Al-Shifa Hospital. These are the continuous efforts being made to try and get anything through to the mainstream, to try and put a stop to this mass murder and control of an entire population, the Palestinian population. And they were the ones who lived there. These were Arab lands, and they have been forced out continuously since 1947-48. In 67, another few 100,000 Palestinians were forced out. BBC calls that flight of refugees. They don't call it ethnic cleansing, which is what it is under international law. BBC calls Israeli attacks targeted killings, assassinations, lifting it straight out of the Israeli handbook for talking points to justify Israeli mass murder of Palestinians. They talk about Israeli response, when Palestinians, every single attack in the last few years, have responded to Israeli mass bombardment of a much more terrifying level. It does not take much to offer some feedback to the ridiculous myths of human shields when we have count after count after count coming out of Gaza about the Israeli human shields, the Israeli army with the talking last night, putting a guy up against the window while they shot at people, Palestinians walking in the streets, still trying to find their own family members in the rubble of Gaza. The BBC has continuously sided with Israel, and it's deliberate dishonesty, because you might remember during the attacks in 2009, there was a call by the Disaster Emergencies Committees. This is all the major charities in England. This is Save the Children, this is Oxfam, this is Amnesty, and they called for a monthly emergency appeal. They do it every month. The BBC runs their appeal. If it's about Sudan, or if it's about Syria, or if it's about Darfur, they ran every one of them. They ran that appeal, that call by the charities, the DEC. Only for Palestine in 2009, when 330 children had just been murdered in 22 days, they refused to run the call. This is a criminal act, and Palestinians would have died because of it. It was an emergency call, like for all other charities that has taken place every month for years. It is the most reputable charities that exist in the UK that made that call, and the BBC refused to take that call to raise money for the many Palestinians that were still living in the rubble. I visited some in 2010. They were still living in the rubble a year after those attacks, and perhaps they wouldn't have been if certain aid had come in on that level that the BBC refused to make the appeal for. This is a crime. This is turning your backs on a population that is not only imprisoned, but living in the rubble of mass bombardment and living amongst the ghosts and the refugees and the many other family members that were horrifically injured, of which I saw close up myself. The BBC has turned its back on the Palestinian people because it has accepted the Israeli narrative. But the BBC has a long history of accepting establishment narrative. We shouldn't be assumed that the BBC has any care for those people in the world that have it tougher than everybody else. It has been an establishment organisation since it was created. And the idea that they stand up to power in any way is only linked to whatever it is our own Britain's UK government foreign policy is doing. Any assumptions about the BBC should be perfectly linked to the assumptions of what the current government is doing. Neutrality for the BBC is the UK government, the UK foreign policy. Anything that deviates from that neutrality is seen as extreme. So the BBC will not deviate from the UK government narrative. It will only argue and bicker about certain narrow ideas, but it certainly will not stand up to the Israeli propaganda machine and the power that Israel has in America. This is complicity in crimes. Don't you forget about it. When you have Nelson Mandela, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, countless other South African activists, if they have something to say, the BBC will print it, will talk about it. If Archbishop Desmond Tutu says that something is worse than apartheid, you would think that the BBC would rush in quickly, given that actually after a lot of campaigning, the BBC eventually came round to try and fight against the apartheid regime in South Africa that was the racist regime that held blacks under control, Bantustans and cantons and imprisonment for so many years. And yet the BBC will produce Desmond Tutu when he talks about gardening or something that's safe and something that is along the lines of the UK establishment. But they certainly won't put him on when he says that what Israel is doing is worse than apartheid South Africa. Have you ever seen that on the BBC? Have you ever heard the word apartheid mentioned on the BBC? Have you ever even heard Palestinians presenting their side of the story on the BBC? It's criminal. And to think that they're still going to Israeli officials endlessly. And it's a sad and horrific shame that when you look at the BBC's own charter, now this, I mean, in some ways it might make you laugh, but it's actually, the consequences are pretty horrific. The BBC's own charter, its own media centre, says that the leading source for news that is trustworthy and impartial. That's what the BBC calls itself. And not only that, but they have access, they say themselves, to 81% of the UK population with all its outlets, including the internet. 81% of the UK population is being fed stories from Israeli officials and Israeli generals as to what they're doing to the children, men and women of the Gaza Strip and the rest of Palestine. There was a study by the Glasgow Media Foundation, which was Greg Philo and others. They found that the BBC's coverage of Palestine, Palestinians, when they were killed, were given 5 to 10 times less time than an Israeli that was killed. So these are the young people. An Israeli death would be granted 5 to 10 times more news time. You would find out about their family, their history. You would learn about who they were, what their aspirations were, their hopes and dreams. Well, Palestinians have hopes and dreams. I taught them in the university. They have just as much hopes and dreams as anybody else. And they have some beautiful ideas and creative thought and actual aspirations to get out and live and have the same hopes in life as anybody else would expect. And yet look at what we get. I lost 2 of my students in the Gaza attacks in the summer. One of them, her entire family. She was a very quirky young woman and she had a lot of hopes and she had 2 little babies. They were all killed with 1 bomb from an Israeli drone, probably made by Elbit factory, which is currently residing in Staffordshire, Shenstone, in the UK. Elbit, that's an Israeli factory. They make engines for drones. Very possibly that company in Birmingham was making the drones that bombed and killed my student and her entire family in Gaza. It shook the whole neighbourhood, that story. But there were 90 entire families wiped out, wiped off the citizen registry by the Israeli attacks on Gaza. 90 families wiped off the citizen registry in Gaza. And the BBC, do we get that from them? They are no more. And they still are continuing these lies to continue Israel's occupation of Palestine. We've just had an 18-month baby killed. Netanyahu went to the family of the 18-month-old baby that has been killed, burnt alive, and it was Israeli settlers, the extreme settlers that are currently taking part in many price tag attacks on Palestinian homes and citizens and children. You might remember the Palestinian child that was burnt alive by settlers at the start of the attacks in 2014. Netanyahu went to this family to offer sympathy. He's just killed 500 children in 50 days. Thousands injured, of which many will be permanently injured without due medical attention for those injuries, and that's a life of agony. And then he goes and sees the Palestinian family of whom they are inciting this racism. You had Israeli members of the Knesset, politicians, high level, saying that Palestinians are snakes, Palestinian mothers are snakes, and we should kill the mothers because they'll be producing more snakes. That's a member of the Knesset. And this was during at the beginning of the attacks. The incitement is coming right from the beginning. It's coming right from the top. And yet, these are the people interviewed by the BBC. Can you imagine that? If there was any other rogue state, the only words on people's minds would be, intervene, put a stop to this now, send in the military. That's what an establishment government official would be saying if it was any other state than Israel currently committing these crimes on a daily basis. If they were controlling an entire population for decades. It's the longest running military occupation in modern history. Even that is by international law for the West Bank and Gaza. And yet we're still sitting there entertaining complete violators of international law. It's no problem for the BBC. They get more airtime than anyone, 5 to 10 times more airtime than anyone. Throughout the attacks on Gaza, you had shows of the Palestinians, just like this documentary recently, we saw the Palestinians in the rubble. Then you had the explanation by the Israeli officials, as if to say these kids and these people that were killed were all human shields, when actually the BBC's own reporter who was there, and he's been around long enough to be able to say a few things, Jeremy Bowen, said he's seen no evidence of human shields whatsoever. So this continuous repetition, ridiculous nonsense. Same for me when I was there, no human shields. It's the most crowded place on the planet. Do you think that anybody defending themselves against the most horrific militarized regime in the Middle East, on the most crowded place on the planet, is going to run to an open bit of land and say, I'm going to get you? No, of course, you're ghettoized. You are trapped. You've been forced from your house, sometimes more than once. Just please imagine what it's like to be forced from your house once and never to go back to it, and the land, and the crops that you would grow there, and the olive trees. Just please try and imagine that for a second. Will anybody on the BBC imagine that for a second? It's as if to say we don't even know who's taking whose land. If you watched the BBC article, you wouldn't know who's taking whose land. You wouldn't know that Israel has gradually forced Palestinians off their land continuously for the past 67 years. You wouldn't know. You might even think the Palestinians are forcing the Israelis out of their homes. It's unbelievable whitewashing of mass murder and military occupation and criminality. It's unbelievable, and it's deliberate. And it's a shame on the BBC. It's a shame on people that should know better. And it's a big shame on people within the BBC who know what's going on. And there are some in the BBC who know what's going on. They know what's going on because there was a group of people who responded, journalists, to the Disaster Emergency Committee when they asked for this appeal to go online for the Palestinians, and BBC refused for the first time in the history of these appeals. And these journalists got together and said, well, should we write a letter to say, no, we should put it on? And Mark Thompson, the Director General of the BBC at the time, said, anybody that writes that letter will be sacked. You are no longer with the BBC. That was the Director General. He's also married to a very potent Zionist. Another point about Israel's gradual taking over the BBC. It wasn't always like this, actually. Tim Llewellyn was the Middle East editor for the BBC for a good period. And he left, and he has been actively against the BBC's reporting of the Middle East ever since. And he says actually people within the BBC, they kind of know what's going on, but it's kind of self-censorship. You won't get your article published if you include too many things that might actually absolve Israel of responsibility, that might actually, hold Israel responsible. So this is the memos. There was a famous internal memo. The current online editor for the BBC Middle East website is a guy called Rafi Berg. People haven't found whether or not he's got Israeli citizenship yet, but he sent a memo to the people operating in Gaza in 2014, and the memo is quite a famous one, and it said, don't write as if you're holding Israel responsible for the carnage that you're seeing around you in Gaza. That was a memo sent by Rafi Berg, who is the online Middle East editor for the BBC. There is pressure, and it's not just pressure, but if you want an easy ride in the BBC, if you want a clear route up as a journalist, you need to write in a certain way. You need to produce certain kinds of news, and the kinds of news that doesn't upset the Israeli apple cart. And you only need to say it's wrong to kill children to upset the Israeli apple cart. You only need to say perhaps we shouldn't be destroying people's homes to upset the Israeli apple cart. Israel is on a quest since 1947-48 to take over all of Palestine, and it would openly prefer if the Arabs were gone. The original inhabitants of the land were not there, and they have committed endless mass murder ever since to ensure a Jewish majority in Israel. This is mass murder and ethnic cleansing. And the BBC makes no mention of this, but they will be held to account, because people are waking up. And there's social media, and there's international media, and there's even American media sometimes having to report what Israel's doing, because the cat, to some extent, has been let out of the bag. But the BBC is trailing. It's behind all of the news agencies now. It is sticking by its friend Israel. It is sticking by all of the Israeli lies that have excused mass murder of the Palestinians and ethnic cleansing that carries on today, as 300 new settlers were announced to be put in to occupied land just the last couple of days. At the same time as an 18-month-old child was killed in her bed by the extreme Israelis that are the settlers that are illegally settling Palestinian land, and incited by Israeli mainstream. They're the same thing. It's the same idea. They're just accelerating the process of wiping Palestinians out of Palestine. And that is where the BBC will never face up to. The historical origins of the conflict are out of bounds for the BBC. How can you make out of bounds the ethnic cleansing of an entire population? How can that be out of bounds? How can that be hidden from everybody when it is the complete underpinning to the mass carnage that has taken place ever since?